What if I told you that one of America's most dangerous serial killers lived a completely normal life for 4 decades? He had a family, he had a wife, he had a job. He was liked by his neighbors. People trusted him. But the entire time, he was one of the most prolific murderers in U.S. history. And nobody knew. Not a single person suspected. Not until a single DNA test changed everything.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most insane cases you've ever heard. This is the story of how one man murdered over 50 people, evaded police for 40 years, and was finally caught not by traditional detective work, but by modern DNA genealogy. This case shocked the nation. It raised serious questions about how someone could hide in plain sight for so long. How could a monster walk among us undetected? How could he commit dozens of crimes and never once be suspected? And the answer? He was incredibly intelligent, incredibly careful, and he got lucky, really lucky. Until one day in 2018, he didn't.
Let me start by telling you about Joseph DeAngelo. On the surface, he seemed an ordinary man, just another face in the crowd, someone you could walk past on the street and never think twice about. But his story began long before he became a serial killer. It began in 1945. Joseph DeAngelo was born on November 8, 1945, in upstate New York. His father was Emmett DeAngelo, a sergeant in the United States Air Force. His mother was Kathleen Bosanak. And from the moment he was born, his life was nomadic. Because his father was military, the family moved constantly. New York, then Colorado, then other military bases. Joseph never had a chance to put down roots, never had a stable community, never developed lasting friendships. This constant moving created a sense of isolation in young Joseph. He was always the new kid, always the outsider. Other children didn't want to be his friend because they knew he wouldn't stay long anyway. So he learned to keep to himself. He learned to watch people rather than interacting with them. He learned to observe behavior instead of participating in it. In high school, teachers noticed Joseph was different. He was quiet, withdrawn. He didn't join clubs or sports teams. He didn't date. He didn't have a social circle. He sat alone at lunch. He walked alone in the hallways. He was invisible. And in many ways, that's what he wanted to be, invisible. But here's what no one knew at the time. His isolation wasn't just shyness, it was something darker. Investigators would later discover that as a teenager, Joseph had violent fantasies. He obsessed over images of violence. He wrote disturbing things in notebooks. He had rape fantasies. But he kept all of this hidden, completely hidden. No one saw it. No one knew. After high school, Joseph joined the Air Force in 1964, just like his father. He wanted to follow in his dad's footsteps. He thought military discipline might help him. He thought structure might help him control whatever was happening in his mind. For 4 years, Joseph served in the Air Force. From 1964 to 1968, he was stationed at various bases. And during this time, he was stationed in Japan. While he was there, he met a Japanese woman. They had a brief relationship, and she became pregnant with his daughter. But here's what Joseph did. He left. He didn't marry her. He didn't acknowledge the child. He didn't provide support. He simply abandoned them and moved on with his life. This would become a pattern. Joseph had no problem leaving people behind, no problem causing pain to others, no empathy, no remorse. When he left the Air Force in 1968, he moved to California. And this is where everything changed. This is where Joseph DeAngelo's life took a dark turn that would eventually affect hundreds of people. He moved to Sacramento, and he got a job as a police officer. Think about this for a moment. A man with violent fantasies, a man with no empathy, a man who had abandoned his own daughter, a man who obsessed over rape. This man became a police officer. He wore a badge, he carried a gun, he had access to police records, he knew police procedures, he knew how to evade detection because he understood exactly how police worked. He knew what evidence police were looking for. He knew how investigations proceeded. It was the perfect cover, the perfect camouflage. And for decades, that badge would protect him in ways no one could have imagined. In 1973, Joseph DeAngelo joined the Auburn Police Department in Placer County, California. He was officially a cop, and on the surface, he was just another police officer. He showed up to work, he did his job. He had coworkers who knew him. He had supervisors. He followed protocol. Everything appeared normal. But something was wrong. Very wrong. Coworkers would later describe Joseph as cold, distant. He didn't socialize. He didn't go to the bar with other officers after their shifts. He didn't joke around. He kept to himself. He was professional, but he was strange. There was something off about him that people couldn't quite put their finger on. One coworker remembered that Joseph would often disappear during his shifts. He would be on patrol, and then he would vanish for hours. When he came back, his uniform would be disheveled, his face would be flushed. But when asked where he had been, he would have an excuse. A traffic stop, paperwork, something that explained his absence. But something about his explanations didn't feel right. And the truth was, during those disappearances, Joseph was committing crimes. But his fellow officers never suspected him. Why would they? He was a cop. He was one of them. He had access to information about investigations. He knew what police were looking for. He knew how to avoid detection. And most importantly, he was above suspicion because of his uniform. This continued for several years while Joseph worked as a police officer. He would go to work, he would help his colleagues, he would investigate crimes, and then he would leave and commit crimes himself. It was a double life, a complete compartmentalization of his personality. But then something happened that forced his hand. In 1979, Joseph was caught shoplifting. He was arrested. And when he was arrested, his career as a police officer ended. He was fired from the Auburn Police Department, convicted of burglary. His badge was taken away. But here's the thing. Even after being fired from the police force, Joseph didn't stop. He didn't have an epiphany. He didn't seek help. He simply moved on to his next phase. After he was fired, he took a job at a local college. He became a compliance officer at Folsom Lake College. He inspected buildings, he checked safety protocols, and he had access to campus facilities, access to buildings after hours, access to locations where he could commit crimes without being seen. And during this time, the crimes continued. The rapes continued. The murders would eventually start. But because Joseph no longer had access to police records, he had to be more careful. He had to adapt. He had to evolve. And he did. He became smarter about it, more calculating, more deliberate. He studied the crimes he was committing. He learned what police were looking for, and he made sure he didn't leave evidence. Or at least, he thought he didn't. What Joseph didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that DNA evidence would eventually revolutionize criminal investigation. And 40 years later, that DNA would be his undoing. It started in 1973. A young woman was attacked in her home in Sacramento. She was alone, late at night. She heard a noise, someone breaking in through a window. Before she could scream or run, a man was on top of her. He had a gun. He had a knife. He overpowered her and sexually assaulted her. And then he fled into the darkness. She reported it to police immediately. Officers responded. They took her statement. They collected evidence. But they had no real description. The attacker had worn a mask, or he had positioned himself so she couldn't see his face clearly. She knew he was male. She knew he was strong. But beyond that, she couldn't provide much detail. Police filed the report. They investigated, but they had no leads, no suspects, no DNA technology, no way to catch this person. So the case went into the file, and life went on. But then it happened again. A few weeks later, another woman was attacked in her home. Same method, same brutality, same weapon, same sexual assault. And again, the attacker fled. And again, police had no leads. And then it happened again, and again, and again. By 1974, police realized they were dealing with a serial predator. They called him the East Area Rapist because he was attacking women in the eastern areas of Sacramento. And they understood this was serious. This wasn't a one-time crime. This was a pattern. This was a person who was going to keep attacking women until someone stopped him. Police organized task forces. Detectives were assigned to the case. Overtime was authorized. They interviewed victims. They collected evidence. They created profiles. They did everything they could think of to catch this person. But the attacker was smart. He was careful. He wore gloves. He wore a mask. He planned his attacks methodically. He studied the neighborhoods. He watched homes. He waited for the perfect opportunity when he knew he could attack without being caught. And the attacks kept coming. 1973, 1974, 1975, 1976. In just 3 years, the East Area Rapist was linked to over 50 sexual assaults across Sacramento. 50. Think about that number for a moment. 50 women, 50 victims, 50 lives changed forever, 50 families traumatized. Some of the victims knew their attacker was going to kill them. He would hold the gun to their head. He would threaten their children. He would make it clear that if they screamed or fought too hard, he would pull the trigger. The women survived, but they survived in terror, absolute terror. Many developed PTSD. Many couldn't sleep. Many couldn't be alone. Many couldn't trust anyone again. The community was gripped by fear. Women stopped going out at night. Doors were locked. Windows were barricaded. Guns were purchased. Panic systems were installed. People were terrified. They didn't know who this man was. He could be a neighbor, a coworker, someone they knew, someone they trusted. Police offered rewards for information. They released sketches. They did everything they could think of. But they had nothing. No name, no clear face, no vehicle description, nothing solid enough to arrest someone. And then in 1976, the attacks stopped completely. Police didn't understand why. They theorized he had moved away, or he had been arrested for something else. Or maybe he was dead. They didn't know. But the attacks ended. And after months of no new incidents, the task force was downsized. Detectives were reassigned to other cases. The file remained open, but the case went cold. What police didn't know was that Joseph DeAngelo hadn't stopped because he wanted to stop. He had stopped because he was planning something worse, much worse.
In 1986, something changed. A man was murdered in his home in Goleta, California. His name was Brian Bartholomew. He was shot. His wife was brutally attacked. Investigators reviewed the evidence. They reviewed the case files, and they wondered if it could be connected to the East Area Rapist from a decade earlier. The method was similar. The brutality was similar. But it had been 10 years. Could it really be the same person? Then, another murder happened, and another. Over the next several months, in late 1986, at least a dozen people were murdered. Couples in their homes, entire families attacked.
Homes broken into, people shot, women sexually assaulted. The brutality was extreme, the violence was calculated. Police finally connected the murders to the East Area Rapist from the 1970s. It was the same man. He had been dormant for 10 years, but he was active again, and now he was killing. Investigators theorized that something had triggered him. Maybe he had been in prison for something else, and that prison time accounted for the 10-year gap. Maybe he had been living somewhere else. Maybe he had been unable to act out his fantasies for a decade, and now the pressure had built up so much that he was killing. Whatever the reason, the Golden State Killer, as media outlets began calling him, was now a murderer, and he was active, and he was methodical. One of the first murders occurred in December 1986. A man and woman were killed in their home. The attacker had broken in through a window. He had overpowered both of them. He had shot the man in the head. He had sexually assaulted and murdered the woman. Then he had fled. Another victim was Margaret Wardlow. She was murdered in her home, brutally attacked, murdered. Another victim was Charlene and Lyman Smith. They were killed together in their home, both murdered, both sexually assaulted. Another victim was Patty and Dick Bartholomew, murdered in their home. The list went on. Home invasion after home invasion, murder after murder, rape after rape. The community was terrorized. People were afraid to go to sleep, afraid to be alone, afraid that on any given night, this person would break into their home and destroy their lives. Police had a serial killer on their hands, and they had no idea who he was. Task forces were formed, multi-agency investigations were launched. Detectives from multiple police departments worked together. FBI was brought in, rewards were offered, sketches were released, but nothing, no leads, no suspects, no DNA matches, because DNA databases didn't exist yet. Investigators looked at unsolved murders from 1973 to 1976 and matched them with the recent murders. The method was too similar to be coincidence. The violence was too specific. The level of planning was too similar. It had to be the same person. But how do you find someone you can't identify? Months went by, then a year, then 2 years. Detectives were working around the clock. Overtime was endless. Frustration was building. And then, in 1987, the murders stopped. Just as mysteriously as they started, they ended. Police didn't understand why. They had no new leads, no new evidence, no new victims. The killer had vanished. Investigators theorized that maybe he had been arrested for something unrelated and now was in prison. Or maybe he had moved out of state. Or maybe he had decided to stop killing. Whatever the reason, the murders ended, and police were left with the same problem they had faced a decade earlier. A file full of unsolved cases and no way to solve them.
What happened next was one of the longest, most frustrating investigations in California history. For 30 years, 3 decades, investigators worked on this case. New detectives came, old detectives retired, some died, but the file remained. The evidence was carefully preserved, and every few years, when new technology emerged, police would try again. In the 1990s, DNA testing became more sophisticated. Police sent the evidence to labs, but the DNA from the crime scenes didn't match anyone in the databases. The databases were limited anyway. Only people convicted of serious crimes had their DNA entered. So if the Golden State Killer had never been convicted of anything, his DNA wouldn't be in the system. Police questioned hundreds of suspects over the years. They followed thousands of leads. In the 1990s, they had a very promising lead. A man named Richard Ramirez, who was the Night Stalker, a serial killer who had committed brutal murders in California in the 1980s, was initially suspected of possibly being connected to the Golden State Killer cases. But DNA cleared him. It wasn't him. In the 2000s, they investigated other suspects. They looked at prisoners. They looked at men who had moved out of state. They looked at anyone who fit the profile. But every investigation went nowhere. Detectives would spend months tracking down a lead, only to discover it was a dead end. His alibi,
His DNA didn't match. His handwriting didn't match the notes left at crime scenes. Again and again, investigators would get excited about a new lead, only to have it disappoint them. One detective, Carol Daly, became obsessed with the case. She spent years reviewing files, organizing evidence, connecting cases that police might have initially thought were unrelated. She was convinced with new technology, someday this case would be solved. But she also knew she might not live to see it. As years turned into decades, the case became a legend. True crime podcasts discussed it. Books were written about it. Documentaries featured it. The Golden State Killer became a dark legend in California. Unsolved, unknown, untouchable. Families of victims lost hope. Some of the victims had died waiting for justice. Some had never recovered from their trauma. Some had lived their entire lives knowing that the person who had attacked them was still out there, somewhere, walking free, living a normal life while they suffered. The investigators felt the same despair. They had done everything they could. They had followed every lead. They had exhausted every avenue of investigation available to them, but they had nothing. No name, no face, no arrest. By 2015, the Golden State Killer case had been unsolved for 30 years. 30 years. A generation had grown up. Technology had advanced, but the case remained unsolved. And then, something changed. In 2018, the FBI learned about a new technique called genetic genealogy. A company called Parabon Nanolabs had developed a method using public genealogy databases to solve cold cases. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of looking for an exact DNA match in a police database, investigators could upload unknown DNA to sites like GeneMatch and Ancestry.com. These sites had millions of users who had uploaded their own DNA looking for family connections. If the perpetrator's DNA was uploaded by a relative, or if a close relative had uploaded their DNA, investigators could find them. They could then build a family tree. They could trace back through generations. They could trace forward through time. They looked at timelines. They looked at geography. They eliminated people who couldn't possibly be the perpetrator based on age or location. And slowly, very slowly, a name emerged from the family trees. Joseph DeAngelo. When investigators pulled up the name, they did background checks, and what they found shocked them. Joseph DeAngelo wasn't in prison. He wasn't dead. He was alive. He was 72 years old. He was living in Sacramento, California, the same city where the crimes had occurred, the same city where he had worked as a police officer decades earlier. He had been living there the entire time, for 40 years, right under police's nose, in the same community, less than 20 miles from where most of the crimes had occurred. And when detectives looked more closely at his history, they discovered something else that made their blood run cold. Joseph DeAngelo had been a police officer. In the 1970s, he had worked for the Auburn Police Department. During the exact time period when the East Area Rapist was attacking women, Joseph DeAngelo was a cop. And when he was fired in 1979 for burglary, the murders didn't start immediately. But 10 years later, in the mid-1980s, when he was no longer a cop and no longer had access to police information, that's when he started killing. The pieces were falling into place, and investigators realized they had finally found him.
On April 24, 2018, FBI agents and Sacramento police detectives arrived at Joseph DeAngelo's home. He was living in a quiet neighborhood in Sacramento, an ordinary house, nothing suspicious, nothing that would suggest a serial killer lived there. Agents knocked on the door. Joseph opened it. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't try to escape. He simply accepted what was happening, almost as if he had been expecting this day, as if he knew somehow that eventually his past would catch up with him. Agents arrested him without incident. They read him his rights. They took him into custody. And as they placed him in the police car, neighbors watched in shock. The quiet old man who had lived on their street for decades was a serial killer. Once Joseph was in custody, investigators confirmed the DNA match. It was definitive.
Joseph DeAngelo's DNA matched DNA from multiple crime scenes. Not just one or two, multiple. There was no doubt he was the Golden State Killer. But as investigators began reviewing old evidence more carefully, they realized the scope of his crimes was even larger than initially thought. Detectives started linking him to crimes they had previously thought were unrelated. A rape here, a burglary there, a murder across town. Joseph DeAngelo was connected to all of it. The total number of crimes he had committed was staggering. Over 50 rapes, at least 13 murders, dozens of burglaries, decades of violence. Detectives began interviewing Joseph. They asked him questions. How did you do it? Why did you do it? How did you hide for so long? But Joseph mostly remained silent. He answered some questions. He confirmed some facts, but he rarely explained his motivations. He rarely showed any emotion. He seemed almost indifferent to the weight of his crimes. One detective asked him, "Why did you stop?" referring to the 10-year gap between the rapes and the murders. Joseph's response was chilling. He said that he had been in prison briefly during that time, a short sentence for something unrelated. But that imprisonment had only made him angrier, only made him more violent, and when he got out, the need to kill became overwhelming. He spoke about his fantasies, how he had been planning these crimes for decades, how he had studied neighborhoods, how he had watched homes, how he had waited for the perfect moment, and when the moment came, he had acted, methodically, deliberately, without remorse. When asked if he felt sorry for his victims, Joseph shook his head. No, he didn't feel sorry. He didn't express regret. He didn't seem to understand why what he had done was wrong. It was as if he was incapable of empathy, completely empty, a hollow person going through life hurting others without ever feeling a thing. Investigators were disturbed. This man had ruined lives. He had traumatized women. He had murdered people, and he seemed completely indifferent to all of it. In June 2018, just 2 months after his arrest, Joseph DeAngelo appeared in court. His defense attorneys advised him that the evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA matched. Multiple witnesses could identify him. There was no way a jury would acquit him. The only question was whether he would receive the death penalty or life in prison. Given the reality of his situation, Joseph made a decision. He would plead guilty to all charges. In a shocking move that surprised many observers, Joseph DeAngelo confessed in open court. He confessed to 13 murders. He confessed to multiple sexual assaults. He confessed to breaking and entering. He confessed to burglary. He confessed to everything. The confessions brought some closure to the victims' families, but they also brought pain. Hearing Joseph describe what he had done to their loved ones, hearing him admit to the violence, hearing him admit that he had murdered people they cared about, it was devastating. One victim, a woman who had survived a rape, testified during the sentencing phase. She talked about how the assault had destroyed her life, how she had nightmares for decades, how she had been afraid to be alone, how she had been afraid to trust anyone. And now, finally, she knew who had done this to her. After 40 years, she finally knew the name of the man who had raped her. Other victims testified. Other families spoke. Some were angry. Some were tearful. Some seemed numb, as if the reality of finally having answers after so many years was too much to process. On August 21st, 2018, Joseph DeAngelo was sentenced. He received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was 72 years old. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would die in prison. He would never be released. The sentence was a relief to many, though some wanted the death penalty. The prosecutors had considered seeking capital punishment, but ultimately decided that life without parole was appropriate. Joseph was sent to Corcoran State Prison in California, where he remains today. He is now in his late 70s. He spends his days in a prison cell, and he remains largely silent. He refuses to answer most questions.
He refuses to explain his crimes in detail. He refuses to provide information that might help solve other unsolved crimes he may have been involved in. His refusal to cooperate means that there are still mysteries, there are still unanswered questions, and there may still be other crimes, unsolved crimes in other states that Joseph committed and that investigators will never know about.
When Joseph DeAngelo was arrested, his family was devastated. His daughter, the child he had fathered in Japan decades earlier but had never acknowledged, was horrified. She had spent her entire life without knowing who her father was, and when she finally found out, she discovered he was a serial killer. His wife was shocked. She had been married to him for years. They had lived together. She had believed she knew him, but she didn't know him at all. The man she thought she knew was a facade, a complete lie. The real Joseph DeAngelo was a monster she had been living with. His wife ultimately filed for divorce. She wanted nothing to do with him. She wanted to distance herself from his crimes. She wanted to rebuild her life. She moved away from Sacramento. She tried to move on, but the damage was already done. The stigma of being the wife of a serial killer is something she will carry for the rest of her life. People will always know her as the wife of the Golden State Killer. That will always be part of her identity. His daughter struggled with her identity as well. She is the daughter of one of America's worst serial killers. No matter what she accomplishes in life, that fact will always be part of who she is. Families of victims found some peace in finally knowing who had destroyed their lives, but knowing the name and seeing the face of the person who murdered your loved one doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't bring them back. It doesn't undo the trauma. One victim's sister said, "I'm glad they found him. I'm glad he's in prison, but it doesn't bring my sister back. It doesn't give me back the 40 years I spent not knowing who killed her. It doesn't erase the pain." The Golden State Killer case changed everything about how law enforcement approaches cold cases. Genetic genealogy became a powerful tool. Within a few years of Joseph DeAngelo's arrest, hundreds of cold cases were solved using the same technique. Serial killers were identified, murderers were caught, families finally got answers. But it also raised important questions about privacy, about data, about genetic information being used by law enforcement without consent. Civil liberties groups argued that genetic genealogy could be misused, that innocent people could be identified and accused, that privacy rights were being violated. Nevertheless, the technique has proven to be incredibly effective, and today, genetic genealogy is a standard tool used by law enforcement agencies across the country. The Golden State Killer case taught us several important lessons. First, it taught us that monsters don't always look like monsters. Joseph DeAngelo was a police officer. He wore a uniform. He had a badge. He was supposed to be someone you could trust. And that's exactly what made him so dangerous. He had the trust of the community while he was committing horrific crimes. Second, it taught us that DNA evidence is incredibly powerful. For 40 years, investigators had no way to identify Joseph DeAngelo. But when DNA technology advanced and when genetic genealogy became available, the case was solved within weeks. Technology that didn't exist in the 1970s made it possible to finally bring a serial killer to justice. Third, it taught us that justice can come even after decades. The victims of Joseph DeAngelo waited 40 years for answers. 40 years. Some didn't live to see him arrested, but many did, and they finally had answers. They finally knew who had destroyed their lives. And fourth, it taught us that serial killers are often less intelligent than they believe themselves to be. Joseph DeAngelo thought he was clever. He thought he had gotten away with his crimes. He thought he would never be caught. He had evaded detection for 40 years, but he made mistakes. He left DNA evidence, and in the end,
technology caught up with him. The case also raised disturbing questions about police accountability. Joseph DeAngelo was a police officer. He had committed burglary. He should have been thoroughly investigated. His background should have been examined. He should have been flagged as a potential threat, but he wasn't. He was fired for burglary, and that was the end of it. No one connected him to the unsolved rapes and murders in his jurisdiction. If police had done a more thorough investigation at the time, if they had considered that a fired police officer might be committing crimes, potentially many lives could have been saved. Potentially, many of the murders would never have happened. This is a painful truth that law enforcement had to confront after Joseph DeAngelo's arrest.
Today, Joseph DeAngelo remains in prison. He is in his late 70s. He is no longer the young, athletic man who broke into homes and attacked women. He is an old man in a prison cell, and he will die in that cell. He will never be free again. But his crimes will never be forgotten. The victims will never forget. The families will never forget. The investigators who spent 30 years on this case will never forget. The Golden State Killer case remains one of the most significant criminal cases in American history, not just because of the number of crimes, though 13 murders and 50+ rapes is staggering, but because of what it represents. It represents how one man can hide in plain sight, how evil can live among us, how someone you trust can be a monster. And it represents how technology can finally bring justice even after decades of waiting. For the families of Joseph DeAngelo's victims, there is some closure. Not complete closure. Nothing can bring back the people he murdered. Nothing can erase the trauma he caused. But there is the knowledge that he is behind bars, that he will never hurt anyone again. The justice has finally been served. The case of Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, is one of the most insane true crime cases ever solved, and it's a story that should never be forgotten. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you found this story as fascinating and disturbing as I did. Let me know in the comments which other cold cases you'd like me to cover. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe so you never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.